Hey guys, we're going to review some of the concepts from the last couple of weeks of activities, stuff about quadratic graphs. If you have the capability, I've posted a copy of this that you can print off and write on. Otherwise, just write some notes on a sheet of paper so that you can have them when you do quizzes and assignments. So let's talk first about the vertex. So the vertex is this point either at the bottom or, depending on what your parabola looks like, at the top of the parabola. So it's either like the bottom of the valley or the top of the hill. So another word for it is the turning point. That's where your parabola changes directions. Turning point is what that says. Okay, so that's the vertex. Oh, by the way, it's also a minimum or a maximum, either the high point or the low point. So there are a couple of other words you might see associated with it. The axis of symmetry. Every parabola is symmetric and always with a vertical line of symmetry. And so basically what you're drawing in is the line, so that if you folded this parabola in half, the two halves would match up. So that's a line of symmetry, an axis of symmetry. And because it's always a vertical line, it's always going to be x equals something. X equals some number, like x equals 7 or x equals -2, something like that. So it's a vertical line. The y-intercept. Just like any y-intercept for anything, the y-intercept is going to be where your parabola crosses the y-axis. And because it's always a point on the y-axis, because it's a point, it has coordinates. Because it's a point on the y-axis, the x value is always 0, but then the y value is going to be some number. That's the y-intercept. Now let's talk about the x-intercepts. And there are some different names we use for the x-intercepts we'll talk about a lot more in the future. So first off, the x-intercepts are going to be where your parabola crosses the x-axis. Spelling. And you might have two of them. Hey, look, two different x-intercepts. Or, depending on how your parabola is drawn, boop, it might have the vertex right on that x-axis. In that case, it only has one x-intercept. Or something almost as crazy can happen. Your parabola might miss the x-axis entirely, and then it has 0 x-intercepts. So you're looking for where your parabola crosses the x-axis. It could be twice, it could be only once, and it could be never. And again, these are points. So when I write the x-intercepts, I'm going to write them as points with coordinates. Here, the x value is always going to be some number, but the y value is always going to be 0. Okay, so pause this, write some of this stuff down if you need to. I'll zoom out a little bit. So pause it right there, write down all these things on a sheet of paper before we move forward. Okay, example time. So if I look at this parabola, it has x-intercepts. Remember, that's where it crosses the x-axis, and remember, these are always going to be points. Now this one looks like it has two x-intercepts, so I'm going to put two sets of coordinates. Like we talked about before, the y value for the x-intercept is always 0. So this would be, and we're going to have to estimate here, I'm going to call that -2.5, or -2.5. And I'm going to call this one, I don't know, 0.5. So there are my two x-intercepts. That point and that point, they're point, so they have coordinates. What about the y-intercept? Well, that's on the y-axis, the vertical one. Where does our parabola cross the y-axis? Right there. What are the coordinates of that point? 0, 2. Again, for the y-axis, for the y-intercept, the x value is always 0, and then the y value is going to be some number on the y-axis. Where's the vertex? Well, in this case, it's a maximum point, a high point, the top of a mountain. It's right there. What are the coordinates of that point? X value first, -1, y value 4. So again, the vertex is a point, so its location is going to have an x coordinate and a y coordinate. Now, point of extremum. So the question here is that a maximum or a minimum, first off? So is this a high point or a low point? Well, it's the highest point on the whole parabola, so it's a maximum. So when we say an extrema, that basically just means the most extreme point, either the highest or the lowest, and it's referring to the vertex there. So that is the highest point. It's a maximum. And when we talk about the highest value, we're talking about a y value. So the highest y value, the top of the parabola, how high does it go? That's the y value of the vertex, 4. So this is just an example of a question you might get asked. How high does this parabola go? It goes all the way up to 4. If we're talking about height, we're talking about a y value. What about the axis of symmetry? Can you picture it? So remember, the axis of symmetry is always a vertical line going through the middle of the parabola. And it's always going to go through the vertex. So it's a vertical line right here. That's my axis of symmetry. Because it's a vertical line, it's always written in x equals form. And what does x equal? -1. The same as the x value of the vertex. What are my roots? Well, they're the same as the x-intercepts. Except when you answer these questions, the roots, the solutions, the zeros, specifically you're talking about the x values themselves. So usually we'll just say, we'll just write out the x values. So -2.5 and 0.5. So these are numbers that are going to do something very specific in our equation that we'll see later, rather than points on the graph. But it's the same idea as the x-intercepts. We're just writing our answer in a different way. Solutions, same thing. Zeros, same thing. It's the same thing as the x-intercepts. Usually you write them just as x values instead of points, but it's not that important right now. Just remember that they're the same as the x-intercepts. All right, let's try another example. Now, what I would suggest you do is that you pause right here and just try to answer these questions real quick. And then as I go back through this problem, you can check yourself and see how you did. Okay? All right, hopefully you tried this. If not, you might want to try stuff so you can learn it before I do it. But I'm going to go ahead and go through it. Now, you notice up here is our x-intercept, or sorry, our x-axis. So where does our graph cross the x-axis? It doesn't. So I'm going to say none, or not applicable, or something like that. Where does our graph cross the y-axis? So here's our y-axis. It crosses it at this point right here. What are the coordinates of that point? They are 0, -2. Does our parabola have a vertex? Yes. It's right there. It is a point. It's a location. So I'm going to give its x and y value. That is at the point, remember, x value first. So 1, then y value is -1. 1, -1 is the location of the vertex. Is it a maximum or a minimum? Well, is it a high point or a low point? Looks like a high point to me, a maximum. And what is the maximum y value? The highest y value on the whole thing is the y value of the vertex, which is -1. Where's my axis of symmetry? That's going to go right through the middle, which is right through the vertex. It's a vertical line, so its equation is in x equals form. A little throwback to last semester. What does x equal? Well, x equals the x value of this vertical line, which is 1. What are the roots? Well, remember they're the same as the x-intercepts. And if there aren't any x-intercepts, I guess there aren't any roots either. Or solutions, because they're the same as the x-intercepts, or zeros, because they're the same as the x-intercepts. All the same thing. Okay. So there are the important pieces, the important features of a quadratic graph. Make sure you get those written down. I'm going to make a separate video for the back page here, and we're going to talk about the different forms of the equations of quadratics that you should be familiar with from doing those Desmos activities. So I'll see you then.